Papias says, Matthew composed the words in the Hebrew dialect and each translated as he was able. Origen says the first gospel is written according to Matthew, the same that was once a tax collector, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who having published it for the Jewish believers, wrote it in Hebrew. Jerome says, Matthew, who is also a Levi and from a tax collector, came to be an apostle. First of all, evangelists composed a gospel of Christ in Judea in the Hebrew language and letters for the benefit of those of the circumcision who had believed, who translated it into Greek is not sufficiently ascertained. To sum up the matter briefly, he, that's Clement of Alexandria, has given us abridged accounts of all the canonical scriptures. The epistle to the Hebrews, he asserts, was written by Paul to the Hebrews in the Hebrew tongue, but that it was carefully translated by Luke and published among the Greeks. This is about the book of Hebrews. Eusebius, for as Paul had addressed the Hebrews in the language of his country. What country is he from? Israel. What language does Israel speak? Hebrew. So Paul, according to Eusebius, was speaking in Hebrew. Some say that the evangelist Luke, others that Clement translated the epistle, one of Paul's letters. So here we're seeing that Paul's letters were originally written in Hebrew. The point of all of these things is to show that, here we are 2,000 years after that time, and we're trying to say what the New Testament was originally written in. Let's go back 1,800 years. What did they say? They're only 200 years removed. What did they say? Overwhelmingly, Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. There is no question about that. There's enough evidence to suggest, not just suggest, but to confirm that Matthew was originally in Hebrew. There is also evidence that Paul's letters and the book of Hebrews were originally written in Hebrew. Let's step back a second and go back 100 years. Let's say it's the year 1908. And you're a Bible scholar and you want to study the original scripts of the Bible, of the Old Testament. So what do? You go to the Sinai Codex, and this is a 300 to 400 AD copy of the Old Testament in Greek. Actually, it's the Old Testament and New Testament in Greek. The whole Bible. The Bible you got in Greek from about 300 to 400 AD. This one is the Codex Vaticanus, the Vatican Codex, and this is pretty much around the same time period. It is the entire Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, in Greek. This is at least 1,600 years old. Now you might ask, well, what about the Hebrew of the Old Testament? This was 1908. We're in 1908, remember? This is the oldest Hebrew Bible we have of the Old Testament. And this is the Aleppo Codex. It's 1,000 years. Actually, it's only 900 years old. Okay, remember 1908. This was written around 1000 AD. It's only 900 years old, and that's the only Hebrew we have of the Old Testament. Which is older? The Greek is older by about 800 years, 700 years. This is the Leningrad Codex. It's another Hebrew manuscript of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and it's also only about 900 years old. This is a Greek fragment of the Old Testament. It's in Greek, and it's done around 100 BC, somewhere around there. But it's in Greek. So this is the oldest piece that we have of the Old Testament, and it's in what? Greek. And we do have some old fragments. This is the Nash Papyrus found in Egypt. It has the Ten Commandments on it. It's in Hebrew, written around 200 BC. The point of these pictures of what I'm trying to point out here is that 100 years ago, the overwhelming evidence was that the Old Testament was written in Greek. Right? The oldest we have of the whole Bible is in Greek. We have ancient 200 BC Greek fragments. We do have a couple, not many, Hebrew. So it makes sense that the Old Testament was originally written in Greek, and then it was, pieces were translated into Hebrew later. Did anybody propose that at all? Did anybody ever say that the Old Testament was originally written in Greek? Never. Nobody even hinted at the Old Testament. Why? It wasn't their language. These are Jews. This is Israel. What's their language? They must have written it in Hebrew. And there is only one place in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that really says that they did speak. This is 2 Kings 18:26. And Eliakim ben Hilkiyahu and Shebna and Yoah said to Rav Shakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, because we are listening and do not speak Yehudit, Jewish language, Yehudit, in the ears of the people which are upon the wall. In other words, these people are speaking either Aramaic, but the Israelites here are speaking in Jewish language. Now, we call it Hebrew, Ivrit, but that word does not appear anywhere in the Bible anywhere. Evidently, it wasn't called Ivrit, it was called Yehudit, from the tribe of, what? Judah. We can assume that the Old Testament, the Tanakh, was originally written in Hebrew because they were Jews. They spoke the Jewish language. It just makes sense, even though the oldest manuscripts we have are in Greek, right? Remember, we're in 1908. Let's move forward a few years to 1947. What did they find? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we have 2,000-year-old Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible, of the Tanakh. And there's our evidence that shows, of course it was originally written in Hebrew, and now we have it, and we can show you 2,000-year-old copies of it. Now, let's go to the New Testament. Remember we talked about the Sinai Codex? Okay, and we also talked about the Vatican Codex. These are 300 to 400 A.D. copies of the Greek Old Testament and New Testament, Greek. This is a Greek fragment from the 2nd century A.D. This is one of the oldest Greek fragments of the New Testament. It comes from the book of John. And this is an Aramaic Peshitta. This is the Aramaic New Testament. It's a New Testament in Aramaic. I'm not really sure on its age. It's probably around 400 A.D. So now with this evidence, we can say that what people are saying is the oldest manuscripts we have are in Greek. So therefore, the New Testament had to have been written in Greek. That's the same argument I was trying to make with the Old Testament. Nobody proposed that idea. But what they're ignoring is the fact that where was the New Testament written? In Israel. They were Greeks, right? No, they weren't Greeks. They were what? Hebrews. What was the language of the first century? Hebrew. We saw some archeological evidence where Hebrew, from the Bar Kokhba letter in 135, have you ever heard the Hebrew language died out long before they came back into Israel from Babylon? You ever heard that? If that was true, how are they writing Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls? How are they printing Hebrew coins with Hebrew on them? How is Simon Bar Kokhba, 100 years after Yeshua, writing a letter in Hebrew? If the Hebrew language had died and nobody knew it. It doesn't make sense. It's not lining up. I mentioned earlier that Matthew, overwhelming evidence, proves that it was originally written in Hebrew. How many of you have heard about the Shem Tov Matthew? Okay, about half. There's a lot of controversy over this. I'm not going to go into the controversy. I will mention a couple of things about the Shem Tov Matthew. Its history is that there was a rabbi in Spain who had a Jewish community during the Spanish Inquisition. The bishops of the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church would send a bishop to a Jewish community and debate their rabbi. The bishop would come and he would debate the rabbi. If the bishop wins the debate, all the Jews have to convert to Catholicism. If the rabbi wins, Jews are okay, they can continue on what they're doing, but the rabbi has to leave town.